Hello friends, welcome to our first class on astrology as a spiritual guide. And the first thing I'd like for us to do is to take a moment and pray. And as I like to say, every time I go into an astrological reading, I don't just pray, I pray desperately. Because to claim to understand the mysteries of the universe, the planets and distant stars, would be a little bit of hubris. But God knows everything, and if we get in touch with the Guru and if we get in touch with Divine Mother, they can tell us everything that we need to know at the time we need it. So in that spirit, let's open our hearts, let's open our minds in receptivity to the grace and wisdom of our line of Gurus, and let's pray together. Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, dearest friend, beloved God, great masters, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Shri Yukteswar, beloved Guru Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, and our friend Swami Kriyananda, we bow before you all. We invoke your presence this evening. Bless us with your divine wisdom, with your understanding, with deep receptivity to your bliss, to your divine magnetism, and bless us with the awareness of your joy, and with a good sense of humor. Help us to see life in appropriate proportion to our ultimate divine reality, our home in thee. Om, peace. Amen. So let's, now that we've got the prime operative through and we've invoked the presence of God, let's take a chant together, because for me, chanting is a doorway into greater understanding. And we'll just chant briefly together to get tuned into the mystical realities present within us, because astrology is actually not just a study of the outward movements of stars and planets, but it's actually a journey into deeper self-awareness, because really the planets only have any power because they reflect the inner qualities of our own inner universe, our own chakras, our own inner subtle universe. And so let's take this chant, "Who is in my temple?" which is to help illuminate the chakras and to experience their light. So with that in mind, I invite you to close your eyes and to imagine that as we sing, "Who is in my temple?" all the doors do open themselves, that those are the doors of your chakras being flung open so you can at last perceive your own true reality. Who is in my temple? Who is in my temple? All the doors do open themselves, all the lights do light themselves, all the doors do open themselves, all the lights do light themselves. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh flies away. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh flies away. Who is in my temple? Who is in my temple? All the doors do open themselves, all the lights do light themselves, all the doors do open themselves, all the lights do light themselves. Darkness like a dark close your eyes for a moment and visualize your spine alight with your chakras shining bright and pure, revealing wisdom sublime. So, astrology as a spiritual guide. First things first, why does astrology work? How can it be used as a spiritual guide? In this class this evening, we're going to be covering mostly fundamentals, but we're going to see how, with just a few basic understandings, we can begin to use astrology to understand ourselves and the universe a little more clearly. But before we jump into some charts, I've brought some charts. I've had some volunteers who gave their birth information, and I'm not going to reveal anybody's name, but I will say their birthday. And so if you gave me your birth chart, when we come to it, listen for your birthday, and you'll be able to identify yourself that way. But for the rest of us, it will just be an unnamed petri dish, as I jokingly said earlier. And if you weren't aware of that, you're welcome to send me an email with your birth information, and I'll render your chart for next time. But before we do that, like I said, I just want to cover a few of the fundamentals of astrology, which is that first, like I said already, astrology is not an external force applied unfairly to us little humans, but rather it is a universal reflection of what we already are. In the autobiography of a yogi, Swami Sri Yukteswar states so eloquently in his chapter Outwitting the Stars that man takes incarnation at that precise moment when his karma is in mathematical harmony with the universe. And I'm not going to take time to talk about karma or describe karma. I'm going to assume that you already have a foundational understanding of that. And if that's a new concept to you, there's lots of other classes and things like that you can check out. But for now, just roll with me. So man takes incarnation at that precise moment when the universe reflects his karma. And this is, as Sri Yukteswar said, because the universe is sustained and built upon the universal quality of balance and harmony. That everything happens for a reason. And so when we are born, if it's our karma to be born into poverty and to have to generate tremendous self-will to change our circumstances, to be a rags to riches story, we take incarnation into a family that reflects that, and we have a series of opportunities in our life that provide us the backdrop to express and work through our karma with the goal in mind of eventually finding perfect bliss by understanding ourselves more and more deeply. So when we look at astrology, what we're really looking at is a blueprint of your individual karma as expressed by the chakras. And that's really all astrology is. Astrology is foundationally based on an understanding of the planets being reflections of the chakras, and then the planets being split into two energies, one a projecting energy and one a more receptive energy. We could call these the universal archetypes of masculine and feminine, but I don't mean that as in male and female, but rather those archetypal universal energy patterns. And then, so that becomes the planets. Then by duality, they become the constellations. And then there is a third sheath called the house system, which basically shows spheres of psychological manifestation or areas of manifestation in our life. And these three spheres, these three layers of understanding, planets, constellations, houses, basically form the science of astrology. Within those three layers, there is almost an unlimited amount of variety and incredible accuracy. But those are the basics. And together they sort of form like an architect's drawing paper that's slightly transparent. I don't know the word for it. I'm revealing my age when I say that. But they have that you lay different pieces of paper over each other to show different levels of the building. And that's what astrology does. We start with an understanding of the planets. That's like our basic understanding of the chakras. And then we layer on top of that the understanding of the chakras split into two modes of expression, which become the constellation, which I've written out here. And then we layer on top of that the house system, and then we see a three-dimensional human consciousness emerge from that. And so when we understand these things, we can begin to interpret astrology. But the important thing to remember, I cannot emphasize this enough, astrology is not developed to keep man bound. But ultimately, astrology is a tool to help you understand yourself, the lessons that you need to learn more quickly and more deeply, so you can go back to the center of who you are, bliss. As a fun aside, at the center of most horoscopes that are drawn in this style, this being a representation of the constellations starting with the sign Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, etc. But at the center, they always draw a symbol of Om, which is the universal vibration that creates creation. And so a beautiful visualization is no matter where we are on the constellations, no matter where our planets fall, no matter where the energy manifests in our spine, the ultimate goal of astrology is to help us get back to the center, is to help us get back to Om. That's really our true home. There's no place like Om. But the journey to get there is one of endless interest and is infinitely variegated. And astrology can help us to understand that journey home. As Sri Yukteswar again put it, he said, the wise traveler takes advantage of any convenient shortcut. And that's what we're hoping to do with astrology. So now I'm going to jump into those three basic fundamentals. And forgive me if this seems like it's going a little bit fast. If you want to learn more, I'd highly recommend Swami Kriyananda's book, Your Sun Sign as a Spiritual Guide. This is actually more talking about Western astrology, but it's an incredible book on astrology in itself. And even though I practice Eastern astrology, Vedic astrology, I find that virtually everything he writes holds true. So, the planets, like I said, they relate to the chakras. And first, I'd just like to connect the dots a little bit. And so for that, I'm going to come over here and reference my other nifty whiteboard, which perhaps you might not be able to see very well. But it's a diagram of a person and with the chakras highlighted in different colors. And the sun in our solar system is the kingpin of our whole solar system. Literally, his energy and magnetism keeps the universe in balance and in sway. And so too, in the human body, the spiritual eye, the seat of light in the human body, is correlated to the planet, the sun. And this makes a lot of sense because the sun is the source of all radiance, of all life, of all power, of all inspiration. His light is the light that is reflected by the other planets. Just they specialize on his behalf in displaying a certain quality of his ray. And so too, in the human, this light at the spiritual eye is the essence of who we are. This is our soul nature, which then becomes specified as it descends down the spine into more and more into materialization. So when I talk about the sun, we're talking about your soul nature. We're talking about the inherent knowing at the very center of who you are, that you are a child of God, ultimately. But on lower levels, the sun also represents, again, that source of vital power. So our vitality, our confidence, our self-assurance, our ability to project our energy into the world. Then the next would be the medulla oblongata, the negative pole of the sixth chakra. And this is represented by the planet, the moon. And the sun and the moon are like a married pair. They're like a married couple, that they're always sort of seen as complementary pairs. That the sun is the father, moon is the mother. And in our own anatomy, remember the sun is the spiritual eye, like super consciousness, and the medulla is our individuality receiving God's light. So the moon is the medulla. Moon relates to ego. Moon relates to our personality. It relates to what we are identified with. And it becomes the originating force of our feelings and our emotions. We'll come back to that. This is important. Then the next chakra down is the throat chakra. And this is the home of Mercury, the planet Mercury. And here, Mercury specializes in being able to communicate, is one of his famous attributes. And in Greek mythology, Hermes is the god of the throat chakra of Mercury. And he is the divine messenger. And his function is to communicate both with the gods and with man. And so for us, just as an example, this chakra of calmness helps us to interiorize our awareness and perceive dharma, to perceive higher truth. That is the messenger of the gods, calmness, that then we can listen to intuitive guidance and act accordingly in the world. Then Venus becomes the heart chakra, and this makes sense. Venus, the goddess of beauty, the goddess of love, appropriately correlated to the heart. Then Mars becomes the fiery warrior at the third chakra, our vital power of will specified into this manifestation of reality. But ultimately, Mars is not just the god of war and destruction. That's a rather Rajasic manifestation of his power. Ultimately, Mars becomes the power of transformation, that his goal is to transform all of our base energy into divine aspiration, like a fire ceremony. Then at the second chakra, we get the planet Jupiter, whose goal is to help us to expand our sense of life, to expand our sense of awareness, to embrace a larger reality, and through devotional aspiration to reach for the stars. Then at the base chakra, the Muladhara chakra, we have the planet Saturn and the earth element, which helps us to materialize our principles into practical realities. On a lower level, Saturn is also famous for getting us in trouble with things like fear, anxiety, depression, loss, and a whole slew of other uncomfortable things. But we'll get to that later in some of the classes. I decided to save Saturn and Jupiter for class 3. So you'll have to come back to hear more about them. But so in essence, when we talk about the planets, the placement of any of the planets, we're really talking about energy contained within these chakras. So if I say, for example, that someone has a very powerful sun, what we can begin to realize is what that's really saying is that person has a lot of energy in their brain. It means they have a lot of light in their brain, and that would give qualities of the sun in astrology, things like self-assurance, confidence, the ability to project yourself, to be creative and dynamic, self-determining. Those are all very solar-like qualities. Similarly, if I were to say that someone had a very strong moon, we could immediately guess that this person is probably sensitive, probably compassionate, kind, aware of the needs of others. And perhaps has a sense for the mystical side of life, because it's that more receptive quality. And so on and so forth. Mercury is famous, like I said, for being a good communicator or being for a good merchant, because it understands things at their very essential nature. Because Mercury's ability is to see things at the very depths of what they are and also for how they relate to the universal whole. So I'm actually going to pause there. And now I'm going to talk about the signs very briefly. Again, my goal is just to give us a little groundwork to then explore and have some fun together. So the planets each rule 2 constellations by duality. That Mars, for example, that fiery power of self-transformation, when he's expressing his energy in that masculine, outwardly expressed force, that becomes the constellation Aries. And Aries is symbolized, as we probably classically know, by the ram, with his big horns on his head, with his head down, charging into a new life. And Aries people are like that. They're initiators, they're starters, they're courageous, they're adventure-seeking. Sometimes they're a little blind. Sometimes they don't like to pause and think and reflect. But then the other quality of the other sign of Mars would be Scorpio, which is the feminine quality of Mars, which, just as an example, feminine does not mean weak. In fact, Scorpio people are often known for being some of the greatest athletes and warriors or soldiers, because they're using that Martian energy in a more physical way. Whereas Aries is very mentally oriented, very mind-oriented. Scorpio is the intensity of feeling. So Scorpio people are known for being able to generate incredible, intense, focused, feeling-oriented power to overcome obstacles. So these Scorpio people can become deep mystics, just as an example. I don't want to get too caught into these signs. But so the sun and the moon are the only planets that don't rule two constellations because, like I said, they're like a married couple, father, mother. And so the moon, or I'll start with the sun. The sun rules Leo, that's the spiritual eye. And his wife, the moon, rules Cancer, that's the medulla oblongata. And then next, the chakra would be Mercury, and Mercury rules Virgo and Gemini. And then next is Venus, who rules Libra and Taurus. Then next comes Mars, who rules Aries and Scorpio. Then Jupiter, who rules Pisces and Sagittarius. And lastly, Saturn, who rules Aquarius and Capricorn. And so we could see that in a chart displayed in this way, this point right here between Cancer and Leo could sort of be described as the spiritual eye. And this point here between Aquarius and Capricorn could sort of be described as the Muladhara chakra, first chakra. And then the rest falling in between somewhere. But this is important to remember because in essence, the constellations are just like vassals of the planets, and they express a little more particularized ray of planetary energy. And so, for example, the moon, who relates to the cosmic feminine, the cosmic mother, Cancer is archetypally the sign of the mother, sign of a home, sign representing our inner feelings and our happiness. And Leo, for example, the constellation Leo is an indicator of the father, or of creativity, or of the ability to have children, to father children, be it literally human children or the children of your own creative thoughts. And so astrology, though simple in some regards, it requires some intuition to plumb some of its more subtle depths. So anyway, that's just a little bit about the signs. I'll get more into it when I take charts because then it becomes less ethereal and more practical, which can make it more fun. Then lastly is the houses. And I'm going to show you a little mark that you'll see on a horoscope, perhaps even on a horoscope that I send you if you submitted your birth information. There will be a little line in one of these 12 boxes, and it looks like this. It's just a little dash in the corner. And that indicates that that was the constellation that was on the eastern horizon. Now, bear with me, we're almost done with the esoteric elements, but that's actually an incredibly important part of astrology. Because in Eastern tradition, they say that energy originates in the east and travels to the west. And this is, again, a reflection of our own inner anatomy, that this point, the spiritual eye, is the center of, is the eastern center in the body. So energy originates at that spiritual point and then is drawn into the rest of the body. And so in astrology, whatever constellation was literally on the eastern horizon at the moment of somebody's birth becomes their rising sign, because it's literally the constellation that was rising on that eastern horizon. But I like to think of the rising sign as being like the lens of a kaleidoscope, that it's that point through which all light must enter to be split into the variegated possibilities of your horoscope. But the rising sign is the origin point. It's the most important point of the horoscope because from that point we see how everything else pertains. It's the I am center. It's the place of origin. And so in astrology, there are 12 constellations. And whatever constellation is on the eastern horizon becomes the first house. So like I mentioned at the beginning, houses are a way of showing different levels of our psychology. But not that, I don't mean psychology. They show different manifestations of our energy projecting outwards into the world, where the energy of the planets and the constellations manifest specifically. And so there are 12 houses, and they each represent a segment of the journey that all energy goes through, of initiation, maturation, and resolution. And so houses 1 through 12 show that cycle of initiation, maturation, resolution. And so basically, if Aries was your ascendant sign, this would be the first house, Taurus would become the second, Gemini the third, Cancer the fourth, Leo the fifth, and et cetera, all the way to Pisces being the 12th. But what's one very interesting thing about astrology is obviously not everybody is an Aries ascendant. It depends virtually upon what time you were born. And an ascendant, the constellation on the eastern horizon changes on average about every 2 hours because there are 24 hours in the day and we have to go through the entire circuit. So 2 times 12 is 24. So this is why, one of the reasons why getting an accurate birth time is very important, because if being an Aries ascendant or being a Taurus ascendant would drastically change the rest of your horoscope. So now, I'm not going to wade in too deeply into the house system. I think rather we'll just let examples speak for themselves. So I'm actually going to erase the numbers I wrote down so as not to confuse us, because I actually don't know that I have any Aries ascendant people in my list of horoscopes for tonight. So just to make clear the slate. At this juncture, I would ask for any questions, but obviously not able to read them. But actually, if you put them in the comment section, Sai Ganesh can read them out to me. So today, now that we've covered the basics, now we can get into the fun. So today I wanted to focus on the first 3 planets, the Sun, the Moon, and Mercury, and talk about them archetypally, just briefly, to give us an illustration of their variation of consciousness, and then we'll take some examples and show how they manifest themselves in the lives of both very famous people and also perhaps your chart if you submitted it to me. So here's a story that has characters who represent the Sun, the Moon, and Mercury. And I'm just going to tell the story, and then you can try and guess who's who. So once upon a time in ancient India, there was a great avatar named Lord Rama. Already this is giving you a hint of maybe which character he represents. But he was an incarnation of God, an incarnation of pure awareness of spirit. And through a series of unfortunate circumstances, which I won't tell at this juncture, he and his wife were banished from their kingdom and forced to wander in exile for a period of time. So him and his wife, Sita, can you guess who she might represent? Are wandering through the forest in exile, but with them in attendance comes Rama's younger brother Lakshman, who is so devoted to Rama he can't bear to be separated from him. And they travel through the forest very happily, doing good deeds and doing spiritual work and in meditation and communion with saints. They're having a wonderful time of things, actually. And then one fine day, they are resting in their forest hovel, and they look out, and Sita, Rama's wife, sees a beautiful deer, but not an ordinary deer. This deer was gold, glistening. Its skin was shining like gold, and instead of little dots like a yearling would have, it glistened with diamonds and gems, and it glistened with a myriad of lights, depending on in what stance it took and on what angle the light reflected off of it. It was mesmerizing. It was the most beautiful thing Sita had ever seen, and Sita fell in love with this deer. And she said, Rama, my husband, I desire that deer ever so badly. Won't you go fetch it back for me? And Rama says, my dear Sita, I do not think that deer is what we believe it to be. I suspect it is a Rakshasa, a demon in disguise, trying to play some trick upon us. But Sita has already lost her heart to this deer, and says, my husband, I desire this deer more than anything else right now. Please, if you love me, go and fetch it. And Rama says, very well, I will go fetch it. But in my absence, my brother Lakshman will stay, and he will protect you from any harm. And so Rama, who is this great king, this mighty warrior, an avatar of God, takes up his bow and his arrows, and he goes on the hunt to try and hunt down this deer. And he hunts this deer, and they go leaping over hill and valley, through mountain and forest. And every time Rama is about to catch the deer, it evades him. Until finally, he realizes that this truly is no ordinary deer. So he takes an arrow and he pierces the deer through the heart. And as the deer is dying, sure enough, it transforms into a demon. And the demon cries out in imitation of Rama's own voice, "Help, help, I've been slain!" And hearing this, miles away, Sita becomes very agitated. And fearing for the life of her husband, she turns to Lakshman, who is also a very brave warrior, and says, "Lakshman, you must go after him." And Lakshman says, "No! Rama said I'm to stay and protect you, and I will obey him." And Sita unfortunately employs some rather unfair persuasion and actually insults Lakshman and insults him by saying that she accuses him of desiring her for himself. And finally, Lakshman can't endure this shame, and he says, "Very well, I will go and find Rama." But before he goes, he draws a circle around Sita, and he says, "This is a magic circle. As long as you stay within it, you'll be safe." And with that, he runs off to find his brother. There Sita rests when a demon king, who is desiring after Sita, disguised as a holy beggar, comes into their clearing and holds out his begging bowl, asking for alms. And when Sita tells him, "Oh, but I can't cross the line to give you the alms," the beggar Brahmin says, "Oh, but I'm just a frail old man. Please, won't you help me?" And so Sita, out of compassion for this old man, takes a single step over that line to give him alms. And in that moment, the demon king grabs her and transforms into his terrible self and whisks her away on his chariot. And that's one of those stories of the Ramayana, which then instigates Rama to raising an army and going and slaying the demon king Ravana and reuniting with his love Sita. But this is an interesting story and reflects very directly the inner relationship of these three important planets. And this dance, this action between Rama, Sita, and Lakshman happens within each of us. And it's cleverly disguised in allegory, but each one of us experience this, perhaps every day. And so now, quiz time, who do you think Rama represents? Rama's the sun. Rama is that part of us that is aware of divine truth, that is the spark of God within us. And Rama has the awareness, Rama has the intuition to know that the deer is false. But Sita represents the moon, who, when Sita is absorbed on Rama, when Sita, our moon, is absorbed in the divine, then we are safe. But when we become infatuated with material desires, which though they appear beautiful on the surface, are really demons in hiding, then that feeling nature, that ego, that desire, has the capability of overriding the sun momentarily, our higher judgment, our intuition, and she sends him away. And then so now we're down to 2 out of 3, so by process of elimination, Lakshman represents Mercury. And interestingly, the planet Mercury is always found in close attendance to the sun. Mercury and the sun are always in a constant dance, very close to each other due to the nature of its orbit and our relationship to them. And Lakshman is the same. Lakshman always is near to Rama. So Lakshman is a great example of Mercury. But Mercury is also aware. He has enough receptivity to remember the truth from his brother Rama, but still he too is fooled, and he is convinced by Sita's desires, and he leaves. And when we lose our soul remembrance and our good habits, our good qualities, and our divine faculties of divine calmness and adherence to Dharma, then whoops, we slipped on the banana peel and we're back into delusion. And this can happen at any time. This is not something, this happened at the beginning of our soul's evolution, but this happens any day. When our ego becomes fixated on wanting revenge, and we forget our higher soul nature and we forget our good qualities in pursuit of that revenge, it's the same thing. So that's just a little bit about those 3 planets. And so next time you find yourself fixated on something of the material world, you can remind yourself, I'm not going to usurp Rama, and I'm not going to belittle Lakshman, my Mercury. I'm going to listen to their good counsel, and I'm going to do what I know is best. So now let's take a look at how these planets interact in some people's charts. Because these stories are, tied up very nicely with a string, but often in our lives they interact, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes beautifully, and sometimes very destructively. And when we do look at an individual's chart, often what we're trying to do is we're trying to ask ourselves what planets are in essence benefic, meaning they help draw us towards a greater sense of reality, towards our dharma, towards God realization, and which planets are giving us a little friction along the way. And how can we learn to harmonize all of these influences within us? So that way, like in this story, the trio works together rather than working against one another. So the first example that I'd like to use is appropriately that of my guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, because he has some wonderful examples of all three of these planets that are very easily identified in his life if you're familiar with them. So Yogananda was born as a Leo ascendant, which means that at the moment of his first inhalation, the constellation Leo was on the eastern horizon. And on that eastern horizon, in the constellation Leo, was the planet the moon, which this means literally that if you were to go outside at the moment he took his first breath and you looked to the east, you'd see the moon. And that was easily visible. So already Leo, the lion, the constellation associated with the sun, one of the, actually I'm going to draw my little line first. One of the classic analogies of the sun is the king. And Yogananda was nothing if not kingly. But he was not a king of this material world. He was a mystic king. And already in his horoscope we can see that exemplified, because on his ascendant in Leo is the moon. And for him, the moon rules, like I said earlier, the moon rules the constellation Cancer. And so that means wherever the moon is placed in a horoscope, it takes on some qualities of Cancer. And so for Yogananda, he had the moon located in Leo on his first house. So he was like a king. But he was not just an ordinary king, he was a king of moon-like quality. And for him, the moon rules Cancer, the 12th house. And like I said, I didn't get into this earlier, so you'll just have to take my word on it. The 12th house is the house of realities other than this one. It's the house of mystic surrender. And so Master was not just a king, but he was a king whose kingdom is not of this world. And he truly exemplified that. He had great magnetism and power, but his power was to draw people closer to God. And moon represents a little bit of our personality, like our ego, this present manifestation of God in this human body. And Master was like a king, a representative on behalf of the great ones and the masters. And that's what he would say in some of his recordings. I have been sent by Babaji and the great ones to bring a new ray of realization into the world. And that's a very Leo-like quality. And that was his sort of personality, his mission in this world. And then his son, which is the ruler of his first house. So I actually better pause myself for a second and just say, remember I said that the planets split into two, become the constellations, and that is reflected in that in everybody's horoscope, every planet retains rulership of those constellations, which then influence how that planet manifests its energy in our life. So Master, being a Leo ascendant, means that Leo is like his home country. But that makes, and he has moon in his home country, so he's like a Leo with moon emphasis. But the sun is the ruler of Leo. So that means Leo is his country, but the sun is like his president, like the leader of his horoscope in a certain way. And his sun was in Sagittarius, which is the sign of the spiritual aspirant. And the sun is the leader, a king, someone who likes to share energy, light, and inspiration. And for him, if we count the houses, Leo 1, Virgo 2, Libra 3, Scorpio 4, Sagittarius 5, he had sun in Sagittarius in the 5th house, which, if you're following me, gives his sun a 5th house emphasis. And the 5th house relates to teaching, to sharing that spark of creativity and original joy within you with other people. That you share what you have discovered, you share your own realization with others. And by that sharing, you help to multiply it. The 5th house is called often the house of children, but we don't need to take it literally. Though, in fact, Master had thousands, millions of children. We're all his children. We're all his chelas. And so Master, with his Leo rising, moon there on the ascendant, and sun in the 5th house, gave him great mystic authority, manifesting the mystic power and magnetism in the world, and gave him the ability to share it with many, to be a dynamic teacher, and to share his light freely with everyone. And Master, of course, exemplified that perfectly. All you have to do is listen to his voice in a lecture, and you can feel the electrifying power of his energy and magnetism. And so, just as an example, if you happen to have planets in the 5th house, you could just think of, how did Yogananda express that 5th house energy? By being creative, by sharing, by taking what he'd learned and giving it to other people, by being fruitful in the gifts that had been given into him. So we can emulate his behavior, even though it might not manifest exactly the same. But then what's interesting is we're talking about the sun, moon, and Mercury. Well, Master Yogananda also had his Mercury located in Sagittarius, in that 5th house. And Mercury represents our ability to communicate. And so he didn't teach, like if he only had the sun in the 5th house in Sagittarius, maybe that would have been more indicative of someone who was like a father. But he had sun Mercury there together, which is a powerful combination. And Mercury is the great communicator that likes to distill truth and make it applicable to your present circumstances, making it real to and applicable to reality now. And so Master was not just coming to teach eternal truths in a vacuum. He came to show us how to live super consciously now. And all you had to do was look at the title of his courses to see things that exemplified that. So if you have Mercury and the sun together, you might think of, how can I use my Mercury to receive the inner light of inspiration and share it practically with other people? As a fun coincidence, or not coincidence, but just as an astrological aside, Mercury for Yogananda rules Virgo, or Mercury always rules Virgo, but for Yogananda that's the 2nd house, and the 2nd house relates to the mouth and speech. And so again, having the Lord of the 2nd house, Mercury, in that 5th house of teaching with the sun would give him great faculty in speech and lecturing, which of course he had. He was an incredible lecturer. So that's a little bit about Master. We'll actually come and touch in on his chart in later weeks because he has some other very fascinating elements. But I want to move on actually just so we can cover a few others. So that was just a little bit about Yogananda, but then we don't have to look any further than Swamiji in our spiritual lineage to get another great example of these 3 planets. And they manifest slightly differently than in Master's chart. One thing that I want to toss out there as an aside is that the planets are not intellectual creations. They are specific, conscious rays of divine energy that you can commune with. In fact, tonight, after this class, if you walk outside after the sun sets and you look out on the eastern horizon, you'll see a very, very bright star. And that star is Jupiter. And it shines very lustrously with a slightly gold light. And just below it and to the left, to the east, is a dimmer star, and that's Saturn. So if you want to go out tonight and take a look at those stars, you can just ask them, hey, introduce me to your consciousness. Introduce me to Jupiter. And you'll find that they'll talk to you. These planets are not just a series of carefully defined psychological traits, but they're conscious forces. And they manifest their vibration through us or we manifest that universal vibration in varying degrees of tamasic, rajasic, or sattvic qualities, depending on the level of our own energy. And so, for example, somebody could have been born at the same time as Master, but instead of being a mystic king, which would be like Moon and Leo in the first house, if they were manifesting that quality of the Moon on a more tamasic level, the 12th house can also rule hidden pleasures and the desire to deplete our energy into the world. And so it could give someone, they could be like a magnetic ruler, just think archetypally, who disperses their energy through the senses, who wastes their energy in pleasures. But that was not Master at all, because he had gone far beyond the desire for sense pleasures, and he had transmuted that energy into a higher source. And that, in fact, is one of my favorite things about astrology, is that you can't really look at anybody's chart. There are some indicators, there are some hints, but you can't really look at anybody's chart and make a declaration about their spiritual power, or like their spiritual level of awakening, their spiritual level of development, because that's individual. That God is perfectly manifested in every moment. And our ability to touch into that superconsciousness is not defined upon the placement of our planets, but rather defined upon the degree of energy that we live with. And that every moment that you decide to say yes to life, or to say no to delusion, to withdraw deeper into your spine, or to practice yoga, you are learning to manifest your energy on a higher octave. And you would be amazed at how quickly you could transform yourself. And I'll give an example from my own chart, actually. In my horoscope, I have the planet Mars in Aries. And remember, Mars rules Aries. And so having a planet in its own sign gives him power and prominence, because he's like on his home turf. He rules the place. He's king of the house. So this is his place. And in my chart, Mars in Aries got me in a lot of trouble when I was younger. Because for me, Aries is my second house of mouth and speech. And so guess what? I ate uncontrollably and I spoke uncontrollably. And because of that, I became overweight and I said a lot of very cruel and unkind things. And I hurt a lot of people. I had a terrible anger when I was younger. And I had a proclivity with words that was faster than my wisdom to know how to use it. And so often I would get into arguments with people, and before I could even recognize what was happening, whoom, the perfect insult would come out of my mouth, the perfect criticism that could just totally break my friends' hearts. But then because of other elements in my chart, then I'd be heartbroken. Because I'd be sitting there going, what happened, Keshava? 1 second everything was fine. The next moment you've dissected this poor person. Like, what did you do? It was not a very happy time. But over time, and by the grace of Guru, and by the grace of practicing Kriya and growing up and maturing and practicing restraint, that Mars in Aries has become a very strong, benefic power in my life. And it, among other things, is what's powering my words right now. It helps give me a faculty of speech to teach and to understand spiritual teachings, because for me, Mars rules Aries, my second house of speech, and Scorpio, the 9th house of spirituality and Dharma. So for me, in my own spiritual evolution, I need to learn to take Mars's energy less in Aries and learn to develop it more in Scorpio, so to speak. Learn how to plumb the depths of spiritual understanding, and then learn how to share it out my mouth with other people. And that will give good results instead of bad results. So we're all moving towards a perfect manifestation of our own energy. And I tell you, the moment I express Mars's energy perfectly will be the moment I find God. Or the moment I express any planet in my chart perfectly will be the moment I find God. Because God is the only perfection. And so when we're learning to perfect our energy and we're learning to raise our energy, we're getting closer to Him. And actually, I'll tell a brief story about Mars. Because like I said, these planets are real. These planets are rays of the divine consciousness. I went into seclusion for the first time last year. It was a wonderful experience. And I was studying astrology, and so I brought my program so I could look at the horoscope of every day, which is a fascinating experiment. And as it happened, when I was in seclusion, Mars transited out of being in Pisces, which is a pretty good sign for him, and he transited into Aries, which, like I said, is a very strong position for him. And so for the 4 days leading up to that moment, I prayed very intensely to Mars. But not to Mars as a limited expression represented by a planet, but I prayed to that divine power, that divine source of all power and transformation. And I prayed to God, I prayed to Master, I said, introduce me to your power. Introduce me to the divine warrior. Introduce me to that divine essence of Mars. And I prayed this way, and I did japa, and I meditated in seclusion, as you would. And then on that 5th day, when Mars transitioned into Aries, I had a long meditation, meditated for a long time for my own practice. And I think I went fairly deep. And I prayed in this way to ask to feel the grace of Mars. And then I stood up, and I walked into the bathroom. And this may sound funny, but I walked into the bathroom, and as I was washing my hands, I suddenly felt behind me a great presence. The only word I could use to describe it is warrior king. It was like this great warrior king had manifested in the room with me. And he was standing just behind me in his complete radiance and splendor and power. But not power to dominate, but power to become free. Self-mastery, to be the king of yourself. And I could feel waves of power, waves of his benediction blowing over me. And I just had to stop and close my eyes because I realized what I was feeling was Mars. That was the divine ray that came to me in a very sattvic way, because that's how I had been praying to him, to reveal the essence of power, divine power to me. And it came. And so when we talk about these planets, remember that they're a ray leading to God. And so no matter where you are, if you tune into those 8 aspects of God, into divinity, it will manifest the quality of the planets ever more powerfully in your own life. So now, back to Swamiji's chart. Swamiji is a Gemini ascendant. So a little different from Master already to begin with. So that means Gemini was the constellation on the eastern horizon when he was born. 1, Cancer becomes the 2nd house, Leo becomes the 3rd. But Swamiji also had his moon in Leo and in a very close position to Master's. And so Swamiji's mind, Swamiji's personality was similar to Master's. And Swami was like a renunciate king. Swami was almost nothing if not a renunciate king. He was very kingly and royal in his desire to share and his complete servicefulness to the entire world. But he was a perfect renunciate, that he didn't want anything for himself. His only desire was to be of service to all of us, but ultimately to be a servant of his guru. And that was a reflection, I think, or partially a reflection of his moon being in Leo. He represented for us another great example of moon Leo, of what that capability could be. But interestingly, his moon in Leo manifested differently than Master's. And Swamiji's moon is in the 3rd house. And remember, the houses represent like fields of action in our life. And the 3rd house is related to willpower. Like if I had to reduce it down to a single axiom, it would be the greater the will, the greater the flow of energy. That's the 3rd house. And Swamiji's entire life was a perfect example of that axiom. The greater the will, the greater the flow of energy. That he didn't simply wait for the world to change, and he didn't wait for perfect circumstances to align. He would receive inspiration from his guru. Remember, the moon is receptivity. It's in Leo, the sign of the sun, the sign of the king. So he's using that moon to be receptive to his king, to Master. And when he receives that inspiration, it manifests in a 3rd house way, and boom, he's manifesting his will to try and create his guru's will in the world. Perfect example of a very sattvic moon in the third house. For someone who is less developed, having moon in the third house just might make them incredibly goal-oriented, but in a personal way, wanting to achieve greater and greater financial success for the sake of greed. But that was nothing what Swamiji was. And so, for example, if somebody else was born Gemini rising with their moon in Leo and they came to me and they said, I have all this ambition, I have all this desire to succeed, I want to be financially successful, it wouldn't be appropriate to tell this person, you should just give up all your ambitions and you should become like a monastic and live on nothing but bread and water. I mean, unless there are other things in their chart that indicate that, because that moon in Leo is wanting to be dynamic, is wanting to use their will. And so the better thing would be to say, okay, why don't you be creative? Why don't you be a business person? But why don't you make God your business partner? And why don't you say, like, why don't every Monday morning, every weekday morning, you have a meeting with God, your business partner, and you say, hey, what's our action plan today? How can I serve you today? And then how can I use my will dynamically today? And that would be a stepping stone for that person potentially to use their creative faculties to be drawn closer in their attunement to God, rather than cudgeling them for not behaving as we think they might need to. So that's just an aside. Astrology, like spirituality, very subtle sometimes. Not that that was necessarily subtle, but how we develop and apply these things to ourselves, very interesting. So Swami has his moon in Leo, so he was like the heir of Master in a certain regard, and he took Master's mission and carried it forward, which he did clearly. Then Swamiji has his Mercury in the 11th house of Aries, and Mercury rules his first house of Gemini. So that makes Mercury like the president of his country. Now, interestingly, let's pause for a second and let's remember that Mercury is the messenger of the gods. It's the communicator. It takes the wisdom from the sun and it expresses it to us in a way that we're able to receive. Does that sound like Swamiji? That sounds a lot like Swamiji to me. He was there with Master and he could receive Master's vibration, but then he gave it to us in a way that was easily accessible in the form of 140 books and 450 pieces of music, in all those photographs, in 9 communities around the world. He made it real. He made it practical for us. He bridged the gap. That's Mercury's job, bridging the gap between superconscious inspiration and practical application. And that was what Swamiji's life was all about. So that's a great example of a Mercury planet being the ruler of his ascendant, that was like essential to his incarnation. But then his Mercury was in Aries, which is the 11th house. And what's interesting is the 11th house relates to community, relates to a broader sense of family. And one of Swamiji's great life missions was to establish spiritual communities. And so being a Gemini rising, which is ruled by Mercury in the 11th house, and having his moon here in Leo means like he was receptive to his guru's inspiration, his guru's mission, and he took that inspiration and he manifested it through the ray of Swami Kriyananda to manifest spiritual community. Bam. Thank you, Swami. Thank you, Master. Swami was like a perfect instrument for actualizing that ray of divine light. But then interestingly, Swamiji's sun is in Taurus, in the 12th house. And among other things, the 12th house is known as the house, or not the house, but the home of the Guru. Swamiji's sun was in the home of the Guru. His vital inspiration came from dwelling in the remembrance of his Guru. His vital power, his soul's force, came to express in the world to help establish the home of his Guru in every heart and in a material form of, again, spiritual communities, because Taurus is an earth sign that is related to making beautiful things in the world. So Swamiji's sun, his vital spiritual power, was helping to create a home of the Guru in the world in a beautiful and uplifting way. Again, I think that's very clearly indicated in his life. So that's just a little example from these two great souls' lives of these three planets. And now, for something completely different, to illustrate the duality of nature, I'm going to take a look, or we're going to take a look, at some very different characters in history, but characters, I'm sure, nonetheless, that you will be very familiar with. Because unlike Master and Swamiji, they made their name from notoriety. So, the first example that I will use next is none other than Adolf Hitler. Because, again, actually, his chart is a very good teaching example for these three planets. Adolf Hitler was born with the constellation Libra on the eastern horizon. So that means that Libra was that lens of the kaleidoscope from which all other lights come. This was the point of I am. And Libra is the positive what's the right word? The positive expression of the heart chakra, the positive expression of Venus. And Venus, the heart, is very positively expressed. Libra expresses itself in idealism. It's an air sign which relates to our thoughts, our ideas, our principles, and our desire to relate to other people. And so Libras are typically very idealistic and are very motivated to try and change the masses, to try and get the world to come with them into a greater future. Just as an example, it's very interesting. A lot of world leaders are Libra rising because that essential point of self, the first house, that I am principle, that first point of self-awareness is very strongly connected to the desire to impact others, the desire to relate to others. And that's characterized by Libra. Libra people are very diplomatic because they're able to relate to the needs of others. But the ironic part is Libra people are also known as being fanatics because in an attempt to create balance, they end up like someone running on a seesaw. They run too far to one end to try and counterbalance, and the only thing they end up doing is creating so much, such a big attempt at balance that it creates imbalance. So if you're a Libra rising, remember to seek equilibrium first in yourself, and then to allow that peace and goodness to radiate out into the world. Change yourself and let that vibration change the world. As Sri Yukteswar said, the man of God realization affects the entire universe by his subtle radiation of spiritual vibration. I'm paraphrasing there, but that was close. That's what Libra people need to remember, because the Libra person would look out and say, there's so much injustice in the world, I have to change the world, otherwise I'll never be happy. Wait, what? Otherwise you'll never be happy? How about be happy now and then let your happiness help change the world? And so Libra people are usually very powerful and influential in the world because they're so highly motivated to change other circumstances. But one of the secrets of Libra is to remember, change not my circumstances, Lord, change me. But so Adolf Hitler was a Libra rising. And can we see how the idealism and the political quality of Libra manifested in Hitler's life? He was incredibly idealistic. His idealism was twisted, however. And so, though he was able to rally many people to his cause, it was a terrible one. Interestingly, he had Sun exalted in Aries and a slew of other planets, including Mercury, Mars, and Venus, all in the 7th house. And the 7th house relates to the desire to affect other people, the desire to change the masses sometimes. And so he had a whole bunch of planets over there. And I'm not going to try and get too bogged down, but what's very interesting in Hitler's chart is in Aries, in the constellation Aries, the sun is considered exalted, which means at the point of maximum power. And the reason that is because Aries is the originating point of the whole constellation, of the whole zodiac. That the idea being, at the moment, before all creation existed, there was perfect stillness. There was only God. There was God who was complete in himself. And then, as one of my friends very humorously put it, God decided, I think it's time for creation again. And so God hits the big bang button. And as soon as God hits the big bang button, that's like the burst of Om that creates the universe. And that initial burst of Om is Aries, that initiating power to create new life. And so the sun, which is our awareness of the self, is exalted in Aries because it is incredibly powerful in the constant, ever-new awareness of your divine reality and of constantly expanding in ever greater light. And that our soul nature, which is represented by the sun, does not want to be bogged down in material concerns or practicalities. It just wants to blaze with ever new light, with ever new joy. And Aries is also is all correlated to the forehead. And so the sun is exalted at that point. And Aries is known for having a very strong sense of self, an intuitive perception of your own self-worth. And so putting the sun in Aries would be like really strongly affirming and knowing in your own inner self that you are inherently valuable and that within you lies the spark of God. And that would be a higher manifestation, but as we saw by Hitler's example, Sun in Aries can have less savory manifestations. A planet being exalted does not necessarily mean that it's benefic. It just means that it's powerful. And so if you give nuclear launch codes to a 6-year-old, he can cause a lot of problems. And well, that's sort of a metaphor for what happened to Hitler. So Hitler had an exalted sun in Aries, and the sun for him ruled his 11th house of desire for success, incredibly ambitious, goal-oriented. And it was in the 7th house, which relates to how he related to the culture of his time. And so, for example, he was very ambitious to make a perfect society for his people and for himself. But that was a twisted idealism because Mars was also there in Aries, and Mars is incredibly powerful. And the thing is sometimes these powerful planets, Sun, Mars, are actually considered negative. And Hitler is a perfect example of this because what is power without sweetness? What is strength without wisdom? And so this soul had developed incredible willpower, incredible magnetism, incredible martial strength. But had he cultivated sensitivity, receptivity, the ability to wield it appropriately? Maybe not. And so, unfortunately, and I'll touch on this later when we talk about Mars, but his Mars, the planet of ambitious desires sometimes, and passions, overcame the power of his Venus, his sense of higher idealism, and his sun, which again was his hunger for success and fame, overpowered his Mercury, which ruled his 9th house of awareness of higher principles. And so unfortunately in this case, what's interesting is if I was Hitler's astrologer, I would tell him to wear the biggest Mercury stone, a biggest emerald he could possibly get his hands on, and the biggest diamond, which is a stone for Venus, he could possibly get his hands on. Because even though the sun is normally a planet of great spiritual strength, in his case, the sun, because of the level of his consciousness, the ambition of his sun was not for the kingdom of heaven, but the ambition of his sun was for the kingdom of Europe, the kingdom of the world. And so his ambition and his willpower totally dominated his sensitivity and his adherence to higher truth, dharma, and ration. And so in his case, Even the sun, who's normally a bright, shining planet, became very malefic and evil, but gave him tremendous power, so he was able to affect that evil on a very large scale. And what's interesting is the reason why I say Mercury would have been his saving grace is because Mercury, among many other things, is often the planet of reason, like thinking things through, making sure you've crossed all your T's, dotted all your I's, thought about things from all the different angles. Mercury you could think of practically as the ability for calm awareness. And when you lose that ability for calm awareness, we make rash and bad decisions, don't we? So in Hitler's chart, the planet Mercury rules Gemini, which is an important house for him because it's the 9th house. And the 9th is the house of spirituality, of higher ideals, of Dharma. It's known as the house of Dharma. And so that means that Mercury becomes the indicator of his ability to adhere to Dharma because Mercury rules his 9th house. And so in his case, he's got this big old sun making him super ambitious and hungry because that rules his 11th house. And it's just burning away the higher faculty of his Mercury, and Mars is doing the same thing. And so, interestingly, Hitler was incredibly successful, was able to conquer a lot of Europe through his blitzkrieg technique, which is, again, a very Ares-like tactical maneuver. The blitzkrieg was basically to attack so quickly with so much energy and so much force that your enemy couldn't respond to you. That sounds a lot like Ares to me, that initial burst of energy into the world. But his own ambition and his willpower and his inflated sense of himself overcame his better judgment, which is represented by his Mercury. And his Mercury rules his 9th house of Dharma. And he did some really terrible, terrible things. And he also made a catastrophic tactical error when he split his front and invaded Russia. That's when he really lost the war, the moment he did that. And from an astrological perspective, I would say that's because his Mercury failed him in that moment. And that had his Mercury been more dominant in his chart and less subservient to those negative planets, well, hopefully he wouldn't have even gotten into that position in the first place. But he might not have made that mistake, which thank God he did. So anyway, if you find yourself with some powerful sun energy, perhaps in Aries, I happen to know a few friends here in Palo Alto who have this position, so listen. That doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means use the power of your dynamism for positive ends, to initiate new and positive change towards God, towards Dharma. And most importantly, because Aries is sort of inherently related to the soul's quest for itself, use that power of vitality to discover your own inner nature intuitively by diving into yourself and discovering who you are at a deeper level than just the gross superficial one. So that's just a little bit about Hitler's example of these planets. Oh, actually the last thing about Hitler that's just really fascinating is he had Moon in Sagittarius, which is his 3rd house, which is, like I said, in relationship to Swami, the house of willpower, and that greater the will, the greater the flow of energy. And so that means that Hitler's mind, Hitler's identification with his ego in this incarnation was very capable of manifesting willpower, which by golly, he sure did. And so we can see when we compare Hitler's 3rd house moon to Swami Kriyananda's 3rd house moon, two very, very different examples of the same principle. That Hitler used the greater the will, the greater the flow of energy to try and dominate the world. Swami used the greater the will, the greater the flow of energy to grow closer to God. And so that's a great example of how nothing in your horoscope is a declaration of an evil end, but it's rather how we use it. And yes, we're not going to be able to go from 0 to 60 in a single leap. We have to put one foot in front of the other. But with patient application of willpower, we too can learn to transform our nature into a higher manifestation. So now, I'm going to take a look at some less famous charts to just show how this these energies can manifest in more normal ways. Because let's also face the fact that most of us are not Paramahansa Yoganandas or Swami Kriyanandas outwardly. We all have the potential to be like them inwardly, but our lives are running different courses. I have an example of Michael Jordan's moon, which is very interesting, but I don't think we're going to have time to get into that today. Actually, what the heck, this will be fast. The moon represents like our psyche, our sense of self, our ego. And what's interesting is the moon is a feeling sign, a feeling planet, that its desire is to feel bliss and to avoid suffering. And so isn't that true for all of us, that ultimately what drives us is that desire for bliss? And the moon is actually directly related to bliss. So when we look at your moon placement, we could kind of say that the moon might indicate a little bit of where you're trying to find your sense of bliss. And in the case of Michael Jordan, he was an Aries ascendant, which befits his athletic and very dynamic nature. But what's interesting is his moon was in Scorpio. And the moon is considered to be debilitated in Scorpio, in its position of least strength. And because of a combination that I'll get into in a later class, that weakness was compensated. So it wasn't so much of a weakness, but it was that he found success in a kind of odd way, which is that I think Michael Jordan found success because he was like compulsively competitive. And Scorpio is a sign of intense feeling, of like never being satisfied, always hungering for more. That if I ate 99 flavors of ice cream, I want the 100th one. If I've had, the best sensual pleasures in the world, the Scorpio person says, okay, that was wonderful, but what would a little more be like? And when we direct that energy outwardly, as Scorpio-like energy can actually lead us to things like addiction and sensuality, because we're chasing deeper and deeper happiness in the senses. But eventually Scorpio learns to turn that energy around and seek deeper and deeper intensity of emotional fulfillment in God. And then they become profound mystics. But in his case, he had moon in Scorpio, which gave him like a compulsion to compete. Like he was probably, if I just had to guess, I bet Michael Jordan was never happy unless he won. And that wasn't just a platitude in his case, but that was real. That like he couldn't sleep at night if he didn't think he was going to win. And there's that famous story of him having a flu and being like literally so weak he couldn't even stand. But then when he saw his team began to lose, he suddenly found the strength to get up and play and helped win the game. That was an expression of his moon in Scorpio, that he was like so weak he couldn't possibly move, but his desire, his identification with the desire for competitive victory was so powerful it compelled him to act. And so it's interesting that, we glorify him because, of course, he was an incredible athlete. But I just wonder, was he happy? And so we have to ask ourselves, because we live in America, or most of us probably do who are watching this, and we in Western culture are very, very goal-driven, outward success-driven, and just ask yourself, is that success actually going to bring you happiness? Are you actually seeking success, or are you seeking happiness? And there's nothing wrong with success. There's nothing wrong with chasing success. But can we learn to be content and also very dynamic in our energy? And so Michael Jordan's moon, if we remember the story of Rama, Sita, and Lakshman, moon is like Sita. And so his Sita was not desiring a golden deer, but it was desiring victory in every single basketball game. And it was so intense in its desire for victory that it helped pull all the rest of his chart together to become this absolutely phenomenal athlete. And there were other indicators in his chart that indicated that, but that was just one thing. So it's fascinating, huh? Now, I'm going to jump into some people. So if you've been waiting through the class to see if I'll talk about your chart, this is your moment. The first person that springs to mind, whose birthday is June 8th, I'm not going to say the year because there's only, I think there's only one person who's June 8th, whose birthday was June 8th, who I happen to know personally, volunteered their chart. And what's very interesting is, actually this is a perfect example juxtaposed to Hitler's, is I bet you never thought your horoscope would be used as a comparison to Adolf Hitler's, but it's going to serve a purpose. This person is a Libra rising, so again, idealistic, interested in helping others in this incarnation instead of Hitler's desire to dominate others. This person is very, very serviceful and service-oriented and is dedicated to the pursuit of higher idealism. Bravo. And this person has their sun in Taurus, which is the 8th house of mystical quest for deeper meaning. So they are using their ambitious desire and their vitality and purpose to try and discover the inner mysteries of life. Then this person has Mercury in Gemini, which is the 9th house. And this is what I wanted to touch on in juxtaposition to our friend Adolf Hitler. Actually, this person has Moon in Scorpio, which is very interesting because that's similar to Michael Jordan. But Adolf Hitler, if you remember, I said that I felt like his Mercury really needed to be stronger because that would give him a stronger sense of dharma, of righteousness, of higher truths. Well, this person has Mercury in Gemini. And Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, so he's the president in his own White House. He's very strong. And so this person has a sense for righteousness. And I don't mean that as being self-righteous, but they just have an inherent understanding of truth. They're very dedicated to the pursuit of truth. Even their speech is refined. They probably don't lie. They don't curse because Mercury is often reflected in communication. So it's very uplifting. This person also endeavors, their moon is in the 2nd house, which relates to speech. Mercury is also a general indicator of speech. And this person, I've often heard them use their power of their speech to share higher wisdom, which is the 9th house, dharma, spirituality. And so this person is a great example. Like if Adolf Hitler was receptive to such things, which of course he wasn't, he should have spent time with this person because this person would have helped him. Because this person had an inherent understanding for wisdom. What's interesting though is the 9th house also relates to the higher abstract mind, like creativity and the ability to be receptive to original thinking and thoughts. And I happen to know this person with their Mercury in Gemini, which is a very powerful Mercury, is very, very, very creative. They have very original ideas, and they're not afraid of being themselves, and they're not afraid of expressing their perception of truth from their own point of origin, which is a very Mercury and Gemini in the 9th house kind of quality. So if you have a planet in the 9th house, that's a very good strength, especially if you have a planet, the ruler of the 9th house in the 9th house. That's a very positive planet in your chart. It gives you a natural sense for what is right. And I don't mean that in like a goody two-shoes way, but I mean a sense for that which will draw you closer to God. And that you will probably feel intuitively when you don't act in accordance to Dharma. So that's a very good strength. One thing that 9th house people can learn to do is to, use their receptivity to higher awareness as an example for other people, but without becoming like preachy, and to not be afraid of also using their individual will. That we need to marry receptivity to higher guidance with willingness to act upon it. Because sometimes the 9th house person will go into their prayer room and they will pray for divine guidance, and they will pray very, very sincerely, but they may lack the willpower to actually take the inspiration they feel and enact it in the world. So that would be the balancing act for the 9th house person. So that's a good example of a better placed Mercury. And also, as a juxtaposition to Hitler's chart, Sun rules Leo still, which is the 11th house of ambition. But for this person, their sun is in the 8th house in Taurus, which makes them perhaps more ambitious for the deeper side of life, for deeper questions. And the 8th house is a very complicated house. Well, I'll just let that rest for now. But the 8th house ultimately tries to find satisfaction by depth of experience, by penetrating so deep into the veil it finds the heart of everything. And so this person, if they were to use their sun correctly, they could say, I want to be ambitious in my inner quest for mystic reality. That would be a very positive use of their sun. So, here's another fun example. So I have another person's chart here, which will be my final example before a brief conclusion tonight. And this person I also happen to know, and their birthday is June 11th. Wow, look at that, very close, huh? Yeah, just a few days different. June 11th, their birthday, June 11th, and they are a Gemini ascendant like Swamiji. They have Mercury in Gemini like the previous person. And their sun is also in Taurus like the previous person because they were born so close in the year. But, and interestingly, their moon is also in Scorpio. I could have saved myself some time erasing. But this is a great example of the difference of ascendant. So this person has Mercury, Sun, and Moon all in the same position, but their ascendant is now Gemini. So whoop, 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 the origin point of their energy is a different point in the sky. And so being a Gemini person with Mercury on the ascendant makes this person lead with this faculty first and foremost. Like you could think like if you were to draw a caricature of this person, of like what is their dominant quality, this person would probably have a pretty big head, not because they're egotistic, but because they got a big brain. Mercury is our thinking faculty in one light. And so this person is probably incredibly intelligent. I also happen to know this person is a tech professional. Not only are they a tech professional, they are a leader in the tech profession. And so that Mercury in Gemini is hitting full swing in Dwapara Yuga here in Silicon Valley. Gemini is, one of its functions is the intellect, our intellectual mind, our ability to see the world in all of its different pieces and think how we could reconstruct it to be better. And so this person, and Mercury relates to like technology and innovation and computers and things like that. And so it's no surprise that this person with Gemini ascendant with Mercury on their ascendant is a tech professional. But it manifests very differently than when the person had Mercury in their 9th house. That made this person very overtly spiritual. Like their spirituality, even from an outward perspective, was the defining feature of their life. This person, their spirituality is still the defining feature of their life, don't get me wrong, but their outward appearance, like how they perform in the world, their function is a little different. They're a high-functioning tech professional. Mercury is operating well in their chart. But then what's interesting is now Sun becomes in their 12th house, and that 12th house is the quest for a surrender into a higher reality. So there we're starting to see that balance, and we're starting to see how even though their ascendants are different, there are some similarities. These people might still really get along very well because they share similar vibrations, just expressed slightly differently. And lastly, this person has Moon in Scorpio, which is in their 6th house. And the 6th house, among other things, relates to work, service, health, and overcoming obstacles. And so this person has become very successful in the tech industry, not just because of their mental faculty, but because their moon, which represents their mind, which represents their sense of themselves, and is very important in their incarnation, is in the 6th house of work, service, and overcoming obstacles. So this person would be incredible to have on a team of technological engineers. Because every time this person encounters an obstacle, their moon in Scorpio is just going to dig deeper down into themselves and be determined to find a way to succeed. Whereas if their moon was in a different sign, maybe they'd say, oh, I don't know, I'll come back tomorrow. But the moon in Scorpio person says, no, I'm going to figure it out and I'm going to do it right now. And then that's backed up by their Mercury being in Gemini, which gives them the faculty to actually back up their ambition, so to speak, back up their desire to overcome obstacles. They have the faculty to actually do it. So that's just a little example of those planets. And for this person, strengthening that Mercury is always beneficial. But actually, I'll stop there. We don't have to go any further than that. So in conclusion, we can see that these planets are endlessly variegated, in fact, that they manifest differently in everybody's chart. And even if you were an identical twin, born at precisely the same moment, how you manifest your energy is dependent upon your own degree of energy and magnetism, your own willingness, your own degree of attunement to the divine source. And so I hope you have enjoyed our little exploration, and hopefully some of these things you found applicable to yourself as well. But remember, at the end of the day, no matter what you can do to improve your circumstances, to improve your planets right now, is just to endeavor to live from a higher sun, a higher moon, and a higher Mercury, which would mean to live in the remembrance of what you are in truth, bliss, infinite, eternal love. To remember that you are a child of the infinite and that all you have to do is open your heart to the downpour of Divine Mother's grace to receive that grace in your life abundantly. That's the moon. And lastly, to practice divine inner calmness as you go and operate in the world and share the blessings of the infinite with everyone that you come into contact with. And that will be your Mercury. So my friends, God bless you. I hope you had fun. I know I did. And maybe I'll see you next week.